today's topic is why contribute to open source, right? And the subtitle to it is essentially the strategic benefits of contributing to open source. And it's for both corporations, well, businesses, and individuals. So if we go back in time a bit and look at the original motivations of open source, a few decades ago even, there were very much intrinsic motivations, right? A lot of them are around hobbyists and hackers in the hacker and hobbyist culture, wanting to scratch their own itches, focused on building tools for their personal usage, and where you have really reputation as a currency, right? So the whole ecosystem is somewhat, well, very different to what it is today to some degree. And what's also interesting to note is that painting was broad strokes, sure, but practitioners were somewhat of a homogeneous group back then. And if you compare that to today, you can ask the question, what changed? Well, pretty much everything, right? We've had a massive growth of tech. It's basically everywhere, and you've heard the famous phrase, software is eating the world, which has also been changed to say, well, open source is eating the world. And so really software and open source moved from this really fringe thing to something that is completely mainstream. And we can say the same about the adoption of open source, right? If we look at how companies have approached open source over the course of the last 1 to 2 decades, basically, it started off, hat tip to Nithya Ruff for coming up with this open source journey diagram that I modified a tiny bit to work with this presentation. Open source really started, corporations started looking at open source, sort of ignoring it, right? It's not something that we're really interested in. It's something that happens for hobbyists. It's not what business is about, right? And bit by bit moved in this journey from ignoring to actually consuming, then to shipping it in products, and realizing that they had to comply to open source licenses, starting to contribute, and finally really adopting the culture. So if you translate that in layperson terms, you really have ignore, which is open source is for hippies, we're doing real business here, right? It's like really dismissive, not taking it seriously. And it moves to, well, consuming open source as, it's free, as in we don't have to pay for it, right? Not necessarily understanding the ethos and the meaning of free in that context. So just, let's use it, moving to compliance where, oh, there's a license, maybe I should get a lawyer, try to understand what's going on here. And again, was a very sort of like not part of the community aspect to it, thinking, well, now that I'm using this open source, I can just upstream fixes. That's going to make my life easier, right? So easier than maintaining a fork. And finally, to moving to real adoption, understanding the culture, and realizing that, well, no, it turns out that the model of building open source software is actually much better. Let's adopt that too. And if we look at, I don't know if you're familiar with the technology adoption lifecycle concept, but it's basically the way technology moves into an ecosystem, right? It tends to be first adopted by the innovators, which is a tiny fragment of the whole ecosystem. Then you have early adopters, which start to be a bit more what we call the early majority. So all of that's the first half. Then the late majority, and finally the laggards. If we look at, again, looking at this open source journey, if we look at that, what that means in terms of open source adoption, we can, place that on this graph and have an understanding of where we're at right now and sort of like in that journey collectively. So the data I have is actually for financial services, but it's very similar across the board, across different verticals. So today, And this data comes from an interesting survey. It is a firm called a Black Duck that's been purchased by Synopsys since, but that basically does compliance testing during mergers and acquisition around software repositories. So it checks when a company buys another one and when there's a merger, it checks to see if the actual software that's being purchased has any copyrighted material in there, and then it notably checks for open source. And so they run these reports, reports on something from about 1,000 to 1,200 different acquisition and mergers per year. So it's like a large data set. And it turns out that, like in 2019, 100% of financial services had open source in them, and actually was consisted more than half of the actual software that we're testing. And I think the number across all verticals was 96%. So it's really safe to say at this point that pretty much every company in every vertical that touches software also largely consumes open source. Now, if we look at compliance, which is basically what happens when you start using open source in software products that you deliver, right? That's really the moment where it ticks. It can be earlier for some other companies, but in general, that's really the moment where it ticks. You realize that, well, overall, 73%, again, that's in the financial services, but similar across the board, 73% of companies, that's a different survey, 73% of companies are actually effectively complying. And so, utilizing open source in their products and products that they ship. Well, at least it's a good proxy for that. And well, when you start looking at contributing numbers, you can see that that data really falls, and we're back in sort of the early adopter, innovator part of the graph, right? That's again for financial services. What's interesting is if you compare it with tech companies, you'll see that tech companies are contributing already a lot more. You're well past half of the overall ecosystem. Okay. Sure, the graphs are nice, but what does that mean concretely for the problem that we're looking at right now, which is what are the motivations that you would have today as an individual or as a company to contribute to open source? And for that, again, we want to look at the fact that it's a very different context than it was 2 or 3 decades ago when we were looking at this much more fringe and much smaller open source culture. So first of all, software is everywhere. I've said that, but that's really critical, right? Open source is mainstream. It's used by pretty much every company that's shipping software or using software today. It's widely adopted and used by corporations. So we've really moved from a culture that was more of a hobbyist culture to a culture that's much more professionalized, right? And the other really important factor is we've moved from a very small pool of developers, also sort of kind of homogeneous, to a huge and diverse population of developers today, right? We're talking about numbers which are in terms of 20 plus million developers in the world, right? Which is quite huge, frankly, right? And then the last bit, which I think is also really important, is open source, despite what you might hear, is increasingly professionalized, right? A number that's an interesting one, it's again, maybe not the most representative number, but it's 93% of contribution to the Linux kernel are done on the job by people whose job it is to write that code. So it's a very different place than it was, again, a long time ago. So what does that tell us? Well, it tells us that motivations have probably changed, right? If you're a professional developer getting paid to build open source, you might have some of the original values, some of the open source ethos, but also maybe not. Maybe this is just a job that you're doing, and it makes sense for you to do that. So it's absolutely fine that the motivations today are no longer necessarily the same ones as they were previously. And so what I really want to do today is try to understand what those motivations currently can be for both individuals and corporations. And for that, I'm going to start with this example that I really like that helps us understand the byproducts and the benefits of open source beyond just the code itself. So I don't know if you're familiar with that diagram. It's a process diagram that describes how an engineer does work, right? It has as input a problem in coffee, and the output is a solution to the problem. And of course, as everyone who knows, as every good engineer knows, one of the byproducts of this process is sarcasm. If you actually look at that from the perspective of not like a general engineer, but a software engineer, there's not a lot of difference. The main difference is that the solution to the problem is actually code. You still have lots of coffee as input and just as much sarcasm as a byproduct. Now, if we place this same software engineer that we're looking at, that we had zoomed on, and we put that engineer in the perspective of the broader open source ecosystem, and we add sort of this pool of commons to the picture, and we look at what happens when this open source, when the software engineer starts to contribute open source code. At first, like this diagram seems like very similar, but what's really interesting and what's key to understanding the motivations and the underlying value of open source is to see what happens when a second engineer comes in and contributes to the same pool of commons. What happens really quickly is that these two engineers that might be from very different backgrounds, that are not necessarily anymore working within the same company to advance the same aspect of a particular product or a particular project, but that come from super different backgrounds. You could have a professional software engineer and a student. You could have a professional software engineer and a hobbyist. You could have people from vastly different cultures with vastly different problems, or trying to solve or build vastly different products on top of the same code. So what happens very quickly in open source is you start to have interactions between these two engineers that wouldn't happen otherwise. They might be just code reviews, right? Someone puts a pull request, a senior engineer working on the project, the maintainer, starts reviewing that pull request, making comments. So you have like a whole code review, pull request code review process going on. This might yield to conversations in the issue tracker or on the mailing list about a particular topic or a design decision. You might even have, and increasingly projects have that, regular sort of face-to-face meetings, some of which even rotate as, like video conf meetings, some of which actually rotate to accommodate contributors from different time zones on like on a weekly basis to discuss long-term design of the project or roadmap or particular issues, for example. You might have mentoring going on, someone deciding to really help a young developer better understand a part of the code base because maybe they want to have help with that part of the code base. Obviously, this creates networking, et cetera, right? So there's this whole slew of interactions that happen between these engineers from very different backgrounds that wouldn't happen otherwise. And what's interesting and what's key to understanding what of the fundamental value of open source beyond even more than the open source code itself is to look at the kind of byproducts, right, again, that these interactions create. So jokingly, we were talking about sarcasm as a byproduct of software engineering earlier, but the open source process has a lot of byproducts that are very much more useful than sarcasm. So those byproducts, we can actually organize in different categories. I'm actually missing a slide here, which is why I'm a bit surprised. The previous slide just showed all of these byproducts not organized, and now they are, right? So imagine that you had seen all of those byproducts not organized. And so we see that the byproducts that these conversations create help or are beneficial to, on a project basis, on an individual basis, on a team basis, and at the organization, at the level of the organization. So I want to focus first on the individual, because that's sort of where we started from individual motivation. And so we see that the key benefits that engineers or developers that contribute to open source are is, well, first of all, they level up. Just the fact of having to contribute code in the open and getting someone to review it, someone that knows really well a particular project, is going to help you improve. This is basically the principle of learning by doing. You're actually just trying to figure out what it is that you have to do. You're putting yourself out there, and this is something that a lot of people find very difficult to do at first, and for good reason. It's hard, right? It's also why it's important to have code of conducts on projects, and well-behaved and empathetic maintainers and senior engineers on the project that help newcomers through that process without making them feel bad for it. But the result of actually going through that process is you really quickly level up. When you think about it, you can basically be taught for free by some of the best engineers in the planet on a specific project. One of the other benefits of participating to open source is you learn about best practices early on, and it makes it easy for you to adopt them, because a lot of the time open source projects are at the forefront of those. So just by default, sort of the requirements around those make you sort of adopt those. Another often missed benefit is it improves your soft skills a lot. When you have a problem at work with someone that's not doing their job, or you have a conflict of some sort, it's really easy to escalate this, to bring that up to your manager, who is then going to go discuss it with the manager of the person that you're having an issue with. None of that really works like that in open source. If you want to get something done, you have to make the case for it. You have to explain why this is valuable. If you have a conflict, you have to try and resolve that conflict without being able to force the other party into a particular, to solve a problem through basically calling up your boss. So that really helps improve soft skills and helps improve all the skills that you will need inside of modern companies to do cross-functional work and work across organizations. What this also gives you, right, is an access to an expert network. Once you start working with engineers on an open source project, and you start being involved with it, you start to be known in the community. You know these people. You can tap into their experience when you bump into issues on the job, for example. You know who to talk to, and the best part is this network you bring with you as you move from company to company. It is not a network that it gets stuck, left behind as you move on with your career. You take it with you across all of the different jobs that you take, whether or not it involves that project. And I mean, personally, I still bump into people that I was involved with in an open source project like over a decade ago in a completely different setting. And that happened to me less than, I think yesterday. I was just, there's this person I know here. This is extremely useful. It's gonna be way easier for me to actually get something done in that new project or in that new context because I have this network. And finally, this gives you better career opportunities, right? leveling up all of those skills, all of that network actually translates into better career opportunities. And I want to dig a bit more into this because it's something that's very commonly brought up and worth looking at more deeply. So open source is a career booster, right? And a lot of people say your GitHub profile is your resume, and I know that this is problematic to some degree, and I'll come back to that, right? But the fact that it is problematic doesn't make it not true. And so being aware of that and trying to leverage this as much as you can is something that can really help boost your career. There was a survey that was done by GitHub in 2017 where they interviewed, I think it was 6,000 contributors to open source projects on GitHub. So these were all people that were active and on open source projects. And over half of the respondents claimed that open source was somewhat important or very important in getting their current role, right? So this is, I mean, sure, it's a biased sample, obviously, but what it says is if you invest heavily in open source, it pays back in terms of your actual career. One of the things that's important to note and that ties into the problematic aspect of open source being such a career booster is tech is already generally an industry where underrepresented minorities are really underrepresented, right? Well, it turns out if you look at data for this, that's actually much worse in open source than it is in tech in general. So tech numbers are bad, open source numbers are awful, right? So I don't remember specifically the data for that survey, but I think it was under 10%, for example, from a gender perspective, that were non-men, right? So this is something to keep in mind and something that I'll get back to in a couple of slides. There's a couple of things that you have to consider if you want to go the path of using open source as a career booster, is you actually have to commit, right? You have to do it seriously. People spot really easily drive-by commits in order to boost your GitHub profile, right? It's kind of obvious really quickly. And it's not going to help you, leverage and use all of the benefits of open source that I've been mentioning before. It's basically just going to make your profile look vaguely better. It's kind of like how you would decorate your resume in general. You can do the same thing for your GitHub profile. And if you ask now any sort of company that's doing sourcing or hiring, they actually check for this, right? They know this, they spot it, it's obvious, and it's not going to help. So you really have to decide, I'm actually genuinely interested by this project, and I want to make the effort to be well recognized, well perceived by the community. And I'm doing this because I like it, but I'm also doing this because I know that this is going to help boost my career or kickstart it, right? And an example of that, I don't know the exact numbers of resumes that Facebook receives on a regular basis, but getting a job at Facebook or at Google or at those large tech companies is actually really difficult, right? Well, when Facebook started React, they pretty much hired every top contributor to the project that they could find, right? And everyone that would actually create like a spin-off project or an outside project, well, if they could hire them, they did, right? So it's a way stronger card to play if you want to have a position in one of those companies than trying to go the normal route. Lastly, don't be opportunistic about it. It's not uncommon for tech companies out there to perceive the value of open source and to be part of have engineers be part of that system. And so what some of these companies do, and I won't name them, is they actually put junior members in open source projects wait until they're leveled up, and as soon as they are, and that there are better engineers and more savvy engineers, they take them back and make them work on proprietary software internally, right? I mean, this is, again, sure, it might make sense in the short term, but again, this gets well known in the industry really quickly, and you know, this will hurt your ability to be taken seriously as a company. It will hurt your ability to actually retain engineers. It will hurt your ability to hire new ones. So it's somewhat really short-term strategy and a really stupid one long-term. So as I said, you know, one of the key problems that we have was considering open source as a career booster is that it inherently favors the privileged. And by that, I mean that for a long time, as I said at the beginning of this talk, open source was really something that was essentially done on your own time in the evening as a sort of hobby pet project you would do on the weekend. Well, it turns out that a lot of care work is done by women, for example. So it makes it really difficult for them to be to have just the same access and can, you know, spend the same time on open source software that men could. Similarly, if you come from a privileged background where you don't have to work when you, for example, as a student, you can actually spend your evenings, instead of flipping burgers in a burger place, contributing to open source, and as such, sort of building your resume. So this inherently is not really fair, and contributes to a lot of problems that we see in tech. When you think that you know, an open source presence is so important to get good jobs and good roles, well, obviously not having equal opportunity to contribute to open source makes it even unfair and contributes to this sort of like really big imbalance that we have in tech, that not only do we have few underrepresented minorities, but they're also very much at the bottom of the ladder because they cannot level up, right? So how can companies help with this? Well, it turns out that if you really professionalize open source and consider it as something that you do on the job, that is part of your engineering practice, right? I am not suggesting, hey, let's have a Friday open source where we contribute to open source projects randomly. I mean, that's still good. I'm really saying, like, consider the way you build software as meshed and mixed in with open source, right? That has a clear benefit because it brings in all of your engineers on an equal footing to be able to participate to open source. It's no longer something that you have to do out of the job. It's something that you can do while on the job, right? Not only is it difficult for underrepresented minorities to find the time to contribute to open source, there's also data that shows that when they do, they have a harder time, right? For example, just having as your GitHub avatar a name that identifies you as a woman will make it harder for you to land pull requests, right? I know this sounds a bit surprising and unfair, but there's again research that shows that that is the case, right? So not only do you want to give underrepresented minorities time on the job, you also want to actually proactively help them contribute, right? Give them the space and really help that. And lastly, you also want to have their back. There's a really good example of a company that has done that beautifully. It's Zalando. Zalando actually wrote and published policy that not only their own projects would have code of conducts and would make sure that everyone is treated fairly and equally, but also that they would back their own employees working in open source in the outside projects that they had no control over, where there are harassment issues or unfair practices. So that's something that a company can, I think, really help with. And what they can get out of doing so is basically increasing diversity at every rung of their career ladder. which is awesome for lots of reasons that we could get into, but we don't really have the time right now. Additionally, this will again help decrease wage gap, because the wage gap is tied not only to people being less paid depending on their gender, for example, but also for promotions to be more difficult, right? And this will ultimately also yield a stronger open source culture. I'm just wondering if, before we go into the benefits for companies, there is maybe a few questions, if you want to stop for questions here around the individual aspects, or if I should just dig into the benefits for companies, and then we can have questions at the end. I see there's one question in the Q&A, but.
Yeah, Toby, I'm sorry to butt in here. Yeah, I'm actually kind of monitoring the chat. I don't think there are any questions in the chat right now. There is one Q&A. Jim Bowring, the college professor that I'd referenced earlier, he does have one. So it's a longer one. But if maybe you want to read through that and take that, or if you want to wait till the end, you're more than welcome to do that too.
I can actually take it. It's just going to do weird things with my screen. Yes.
Okay.
Tell
you what, why don't do you want to perhaps just save it till the end, and because we'll do kind of a comprehensive Q&A session. That's the way that we'll.
That's great. Let's do it, and I sort of address parts of it later on in the talk.
Okay.
So the answer is going to be not as great as I think Jim would have wished, but hopefully not completely disappointing. Let me get back to the deck right now, if I find where I was in the deck. Here. Yes,
there. Yep.
Oh yeah, you can see it too. I thought it was, obviously.
Yeah.
So I'm going to start. Yeah, so benefits for companies, I'm going to look at three things. The second order benefits for companies. So what we've been looking at for individuals, but going back to the diagram and looking at that for companies. And we'll look at operational benefits of strong open source strategy and strategic benefits. So second order benefits, also known as byproducts. And if you're familiar with Apache, the Apache Foundation saying community over code, right? It's all part of the same sort of like understanding of open source, which is to say, well, the output is important and valuable, like the actual code, but maybe the process and the networks and all of those byproducts are actually the key value. Oh, see, this is the actual slide I was missing. It's here, which is perfect. So, all of these different byproducts we can organize. We talked about the individual ones. I want to quickly touch on benefits at the project level, right? An open source project or open sourcing a project that you have internally tends to generate improved documentation, increased code quality, lower technical debt, right? And those are like huge benefits. They're sort of an obvious thing that happens to open source project just because there are different requirements as how you have to communicate. There is the audience is broader, the stakeholders are more different, and so you have to really improve the quality. Like the quality improves, the documentation improves. You also get like better testing, continuous integration is sort of like tied into this. So you adopt all of these best practices again. That tend to create stronger, better projects that are more nimble, that can move faster. You increase development velocity for that project. So it tends to be usually very positive, right? And if you're actually involved with an open source project that's external, that you don't own, being involved will help you as an individual or as a company actually influence the project direction, right? That's true of open source projects. It's true of standards. If you talk about web standards too, being there, doing the work, right, is actually incredibly effective to create changes and move the project in a direction that better suits your own needs. So if we then look, we've talked about individuals already, if we then look at the team benefits, right? And this, Jim, is where we'll be actually, I have a tiny bit of data to share with you. What we tend to see are increased efficiencies, serendipity, right? So, again, bumping by accident into maybe a contributor that is working on a similar problem, or that knows about this other tool that can help you, that's closer to your needs, or that can help you solve a problem. So all of these sort of like accidental encounters that can really help you as a team be more effective. It's also where innovation happens, and that's largely due to a concept called knowledge spillover, which is basically the idea. Actually, if you look, if we go back in time and look at what made Silicon Valley Silicon Valley, it, according to some research, has a lot to do with the fact that back in time, there were basically two poles in the USA competing for sort of being the mecca of silicon, right? It was Silicon Valley, centered around Stanford, and the Boston area, like in Cambridge, centered essentially around MIT. And it turns out that the laws in California were much more protective of employees than they were in Massachusetts. So basically, California, you could not have non-compete agreements with your employees. And what that created was basically engineers that would hop from company to company as they were offered better pay, or could work on more interesting projects, or could have a higher, improve their career paths. And what this apparently created is a whole bunch of innovation through the concept of knowledge spillover, which is basically, well, these people talked, right? It's not like they actually stole IP from their previous employer and brought it to the new one, but what they had learned on the job at company A sort of was transferred to company B. And when you do that at the level of like pretty much every engineer at every company, you see really quickly how you create, well, first of all, you create a huge a much bigger network, much faster, right? And that network shares information at a faster rate than it would if everyone is siloed in their own company. When you think about it, this is exactly what open source is doing to tech today, right? The same concept, but at world scale, and across basically all open source software. And if you think about it, again, open source is where a lot of the innovation in software happens today, and that's probably not by accident. Quickly, what I want to talk about here is for what I actually have data around increased efficiencies. I'm also checking the time. What do we have roughly? About 10, 15 minutes, a bit more for the presentation?
Yeah, let's go with about 10 minutes. Let's take it up to about 1 o'clock, and we'll do 5 minutes of Q&A, and then we can go over if needed, and then we'll try to wrap it up. Yep.
That sounds good. All right, so in terms of increased efficiencies, there was actually a really interesting research by Frank Nagel that's from 2017, in a paper called Learning by Contributing that you can link, that's linked from there, where what Frank Nagel did is he looked at a number of companies that were building software on top of the Linux kernel. He showed that companies that were effectively contributing to the Linux kernel were actually twice as efficient at the company level, right? They were actually making, basically twice as much profit. And you could really tie it down to the efficiency of the teams contributing to open source. And he explains it by 2 reasons. The first reason is that the networks that you built as part of open source help you solve problems and bugs that you bump into way faster. And if you ask any engineer, that's obvious, right? If you don't know a project, just solving a really silly bug can take you a whole week. Whereas if you know who the owner of that part of the code is, for example, sometimes it's just like a Slack message or IRC, right? To just say, hey, I'm bumping into that, and maybe there's already a patch somewhere, or like there's a known workaround, and it takes you literally half an hour. So this quickly builds up, it turns out, right? And the other effect is, and that's why the paper was called "Learning by Contributing," is when you start actually contributing to an open source project, you learn the specifics of it really quickly. And as a result, you level up. And so you have much better engineers that become much more efficient and that create more efficient teams. So going back to that diagram, the other data point that I have is access to talent pool, and basically for recruiting purposes, right? So when I was at Facebook, and when Facebook launched React, it actually asked its developers, its new recruits, what had driven them to take the offer. And mind you, that was a time where Facebook wasn't dealing with sort of all of the backlash that it has been dealing with around privacy, et cetera, for the last 5 years. It was a time where Facebook was a hot new startup that had just IPO'd, that was about to do so, right? So everyone in Silicon Valley every engineer was like, that was a really interesting place to work for. And regardless, it turns out that despite that, still 75% of new engineering recruits, that's like 3/4, right, mentioned the open source program as a key reason to accept the offer. So even for companies that were so attractive for lots of other reasons, having a really strong open source presence in a culture was something that was really important. And lastly, the last example I want to give is being perceived as an industry leader, right? Which is also one of the benefits, one of the byproducts of having a strong open source culture. And this is an example that I love. There's a company in Europe called Trivago, which is kind of like a bookings.com competitor. So basically what they do is they sell travel tickets and hotels. And they were heavily relying on Webpack for their, which is an open source bundling for front-end code on the web, and they were, relying on it for their own website. And they had a bunch of things that they wanted to see improve in that software. So they decided to fund it. They gave it $100,000 for a year, hoping that the project would actually, that would help the project focus on the key performance issues that they had. So after a year, the outcome was fascinating. First of all, the work that they wanted to have done, to see done, had been done, right? And it had been done by one of the biggest expert on Webpack in the world. There's literally no way they could have done that work in that amount of time for that little money had they hired someone themselves, had to train that person, etc. Right? So that was a huge win. But what was much more interesting is that as a result of just that sponsoring, they became perceived in Europe in the JavaScript and front-end community as a friend of open source. And they started to have lots of developers bang on the door to get a job. After the first year, they had hired 4. And I know that now they actually run their own open source conference, right? So they really doubled down on this notion of open source as being great to be perceived as a leader and being beneficial to their company and for hiring purposes too. All right. I'm going to run through operational benefits quickly. Common ones is just paying back technical debt, right? If you're maintaining lots of forks of open source projects because you have bug fixes and patches, well, it turns out that moving all of that upstream is actually a really good idea and makes your life a lot easier. Similarly, when you have really big projects like browser rendering engines are, it is pretty much the right operational decision from an economic basis to continue participating in the development of these open source projects rather than forking them and sort of maintaining your own fork, essentially because there is so much work and so much going on that it would be impossible today for someone to compete and to start from scratch, right? So just like being part of the open source community is basically the only option that you have here, unless you have a massive amount of investment and are ready to start from scratch. So the example here is, if it's interesting to note that the rendering engine that we have today in like the most common browsers today, the most modern ones from IE to to Brave, is a fork of the one that was WebKit in Safari and Chrome at Chrome's beginnings, which itself is a fork of KHTML, which was the rendering engine for Conqueror. So you have the same sort of open source project that spans like probably like over 2 decades at this point, which basically is relied on and built upon by everyone because it's economically unsound to do pretty much anything else. Last common operational benefit is to actually leverage external contributions. When Facebook launched React and the React ecosystem, what they did is they wrote papers about all of the other pieces of software that they thought would be useful. They had some reference implementations for some of them, but really quickly what happened is others in the community started building and investing time in sort of these other parts of the overall solution that the React team had envisioned for front-end development. As I mentioned before, then they ended up like hiring a bunch of the people that had worked on these software too, so like multiple amounts of benefits. And they actually dropped the reference implementations and started relying on things like React Router or Redux for their own internal projects too. And on to the strategic benefits. A very common strategy used by lots of companies to buy essentially developer mind share is what I refer to as on-ramping developers. This is what you see a lot of happening in the clouds and the clouds wars today. It's one of the reasons why a company like Microsoft purchased GitHub and now NPM. It's basically the idea that increasingly the ones making the decisions about what kind of software an enterprise uses are the developers themselves. Essentially because they will play and use open source or open APIs on their own time. Then they will rely on those same APIs when they start prototyping quickly a new product or part of a new, an existing product on their job. And by the time a prototype actually is ready to get turned into a product, well, why would you change the technology that you've used so far, right? And so at that time, companies that have invested a lot of resources in creating open source tools, in building a community around it, often for free, can leverage that and turn the enterprise that's actually going to use the software into customers. You see that in clouds, but you also see that a lot with a lot of the more open source focused companies like Elastic, for example, that uses Elasticsearch, that creates Elasticsearch, or MongoDB, etc. Lastly, a very, very common strategic play that companies will, which companies will rely on open source on is called commoditizing your complement. So the way to think about this is if you want to increase your market share, for example, one of the easiest strategy to do so is to make sure that where your market is actually open source. For example, looking at Google, its key focus is search, right? And the way that they bring eyeballs to search, where they sell ads, is by making sure that the complement to search, how people come and use search, is actually open source and doesn't belong to a competitor of theirs, right? This is why they invest so heavily in Chromium, in Chrome, the web browser, and Android, the operating system. Similarly, if you look for Intel, Intel sells chips. The complement to chips is obviously an operating system, right? Intel would have a much harder time selling their chips if it was dealing only with proprietary ecosystem, which is why it turns out that they're the biggest Linux contributor out of all of the different corporations contributing to Linux. Similarly, Red Hat, the second biggest Linux contributor, is a service company that sells essentially services on top of Linux and lots of products on top of it. Again, way easier for Red Hat to sell that on top of an open source operating system than it would be on top of a proprietary one, where they could basically be where basically their business could be turned off at a whim. Lastly, and that example is interesting because it is even further away from what people think when they think about open source in general. If you consider that Facebook's main business is essentially mining user data to sell advertisement, you'll quickly realize that the complement to that, and that one of Facebook's biggest costs, is outside of course, their human talent, is their data centers, right? So a number of years ago, Facebook started what's called the Open Compute Project, which is basically open sourcing hardware for data centers and even data center designs. The outcome of that is that it created a leveled competing field, a leveled marketplace, where every manufacturer of hardware could be building the same, would be building the same kind of server racks, and would not be competing on IP, but basically essentially on their ability to build and ship those servers, which brought prices down considerably. Facebook released some estimates, I think, after 2 or 3 years, and they had already saved, I think, $2 billion. So billion was a B, right, on operating costs, thanks to the Open Compute Project. And that was in 2017. So the amounts are probably, maybe up to an order of magnitude bigger at this point. So it's a huge, really smart play around open source, and a really strategic one that another player in the field, AT&T, is basically reproducing was 5G and all of the open stack around 5G. It's, again, a play to basically commoditize the hardware and the whole market that they will need to rely on to be able to ship 5G across the different places where AT&T does that. And so, again, a really sound strategy for them to cut down costs in the process of doing so. And I sort of rushed through these different slides, so I hope we can have questions around the last ones if you want to. And yeah, that's it. Thank you very much for having me. I hope this was useful to you. The slides are already here if you want to have a look at them. So on bit.ly/contribute, and I'm happy to take questions. Jim,